The OSHA Inspector Playbook is public. Have you read it? The Inspector's Playbook is public. Most EHS teams have never read it. OSHA publishes the manual its compliance officers use to conduct inspections. It describes in sequence what they do when they arrive, what records they request, how they evaluate a safety management system, and what turns an observation into a citation. Most EHS teams prepare for inspections without consulting it. That is a preparation gap with a measurable cost. The document is called the Field Operations Manual, FOM, and it lives on OSHA's website. It runs to 17 chapters covering everything from how compliance officers plan inspections before they arrive to how penalties are calculated after citations are issued. Chapter 3, Inspection Procedures, is the one that matters most for pre-inspection preparation. It describes the opening conference, the walk-around, the records review, and the specific factors that compliance officers are trained to evaluate when determining whether a safety management system is functioning. It is not a secret. Most EHS teams have not read it. That matters because preparing for an OSHA inspection without reading the FOM is a little like studying for an exam without looking at the course syllabus. You might cover the right material by instinct, but you might also spend time preparing for things inspectors do not prioritize while missing the things they specifically do. What the opening conference is actually for and why it sets the tone. The FOM instructs compliance officers to keep the opening conference brief so they can get to the walk-around quickly. That instruction is in there for a reason. Inspectors are trained not to let an extended opening discussion slow them down or give the facility time to stage conditions before the physical inspection begins. The FOM notes explicitly that conditions of the work site shall be observed upon arrival and that any changes occurring during the opening conference should also be noted. For EHS teams, that sequence has a practical implication. The inspection effectively starts in the parking lot, not in the conference room. What the compliance officer observes walking from their vehicle to the front entrance, and what they see through windows or across the yard during the opening meeting is part of the inspection record. A facility that treats the opening conference as the inspection's starting point is already behind. Compliance officers are trained to arrive looking, not to start looking after the pleasantries are finished. The FOM also instructs compliance officers to inform the employer at the opening conference whether the visit is a programmed inspection tied to an emphasis initiative, a complaint-based inspection, or a referral. Knowing which category applies shapes the scope. A programmed inspection under the Heat National Emphasis Program, NEP, is going to look at heat illness documentation. A complaint-based inspection is going to focus on the specific hazard alleged in the complaint. Though the FOM also notes that compliance officers are expected to note any apparent violations they observe during the course of any inspection, regardless of scope. Scope limits do not create blinders. The records request comes before the walk-around, and it has a specific logic. The FOM instructs compliance officers to request records during or immediately after the opening conference, before the physical walk-around begins. The records typically requested in a general industry inspection include the OSHA 300 Injury and Illness Log, the OSHA 300A Annual Summary, the 301 Incident Reports for any entries on the 300 log, written safety and health programs for applicable standards, training records, and any records relevant to the specific reason for the inspection. The logic of requesting records first is not arbitrary. Injuries and illnesses on the 300 log tell the compliance officer which hazards have already produced harm at the facility. That shapes where the walk-around goes and what the officer is looking for when they get there. A facility with 3 hand injury entries on the 300 log should expect the walk-around to include close attention to machine guarding. A facility with musculoskeletal entries should expect the officer to be evaluating ergonomic hazards, particularly in states with applicable ergonomic standards. EHS teams that treat OSHA 300 log maintenance as a record-keeping obligation and not as an inspection preparation factor are missing something important. The log is the compliance officer's first map of the facility's hazard profile. What is on it and how entries are described shapes the inspection before the walk-around begins. The FOM Safety and Health Management System evaluation is what separates programmatic findings from individual violations. Chapter 3 of the FOM instructs compliance officers to evaluate the employer's safety and health management system during the walkaround. The evaluation criteria include whether management has demonstrated commitment to safety and health, whether hazard identification and assessment processes are functioning, whether employees have been trained on applicable hazards and controls, and whether the system produces documented evidence of corrective action when deficiencies are found. This section of the FOM is the one most directly connected to the difference between a facility that receives a single citation for an isolated violation and a facility that receives multiple citations framed as evidence of a programmatic failure. A compliance officer who finds one machine guarding violation and also finds no documented inspections, no training records on machine safeguarding, and no corrective action history is looking at evidence of a management system failure, not just a physical hazard. The FOM explicitly tells officers to look for that pattern. Facilities that have physical controls in place but cannot demonstrate the management infrastructure behind them are more vulnerable to that framing than they realize. Penalty calculation starts with the gravity of the violation, not just whether it exists. Chapter 6 of the FOM covers penalty calculation. The base penalty for a serious violation is determined by a gravity assessment that considers the severity of the potential injury and the probability that an injury would actually occur given the specific workplace conditions. Probability is affected by factors including the number of employees exposed, the frequency of exposure, the proximity of employees to the hazard, and whether appropriate personal protective equipment is in use. That gravity assessment is conducted during the walkaround. Compliance officers are evaluating those factors in real time as they observe conditions. A facility where employees are near the hazard frequently, where protective equipment is not consistently used, and where exposure is ongoing rather than occasional, is going to receive a higher gravity rating than one where the same physical violation exists, but exposure is limited. Facilities that only think about violations in binary terms, present or absent, are not thinking about how the penalty is going to be calculated when the violation is found. After the gravity-based penalty is set, the FOM allows for reductions based on history, size, and good faith, applied serially in that order. The July 2025 update to Chapter 6 increased the history reduction from 10% to 20% for employers with no serious willful, repeat, or failure to abate violations in the prior 5 years. The good faith reduction of up to 25% requires a written and implemented safety and health program covering hazard recognition, training, and preventive measures. Implemented is the operative word. The good faith reduction is not available to employers who cannot demonstrate that their program functions in practice, as opposed to existing as a document. That is the dividing line between a facility that absorbs a meaningful penalty reduction and one that does not, and it is determined by the same documentation the compliance officer reviewed during the walkaround. Reading the manual before inspection season is preparation. Reading it after is research. The FOM is updated regularly. Chapter 6 was updated as recently as July 2025. Chapter 3 reflects the current inspection procedures compliance officers are following in the field right now. It is publicly available at OSHA.gov. It takes a few hours to read the relevant chapters carefully. Most EHS teams build their pre-inspection preparation around internal audit protocols, industry guides, and past inspection experience. Those are reasonable inputs. None of them tell you what the compliance officer arriving at your facility has been specifically trained to look for, in what sequence, and by what criteria they will decide whether what they find constitutes a violation and how severe it is. The FOM does. That information is available before the inspection. Using it is a choice. You've been listening to Sustainability Soundbites by Environment and Energy Leader. For partnership opportunities, please reach out to our team.